Now, my book talks about lots of the documented miracles that have taken place, but the one that I investigated that absolutely blew me away the most was a woman by the name of Barbara Snyder. I interviewed Barbara at length. We have extensive medical records from her dating back many years from the Mayo Clinic and her other physicians. We have multiple credible eyewitnesses with no motive to deceive. We have 2 of her doctors who were so blown away by what happened to her, they wrote about it in books because they said, I got to write about this. This is unbelievable. So let me tell you what happened to Barbara. Barbara was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the Mayo Clinic. For the next several years, she just deteriorated, got worse and worse. She had repeated hospitalizations, repeated surgeries, until ultimately she was dying. And they put her in hospice at her home. So she's confined to bed at her home. One of her physicians, Dr. Harold P. Adolph, a board-certified surgeon who had performed 25,000 operations in his career, he called Barbara, quote, one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. Hopelessly ill. One of her lungs was non-functional. The other was just inflated at 50%. A tube was inserted into her neck and oxygen was pumped from canisters in her garage so she could breathe. She'd lost control of her urination and her bowels. She was legally blind. All she could see were gray shadows. A feeding tube was inserted into her stomach. She hadn't walked in like 7 years, and so her legs had atrophied. Her muscles had shrunken, and her legs atrophied. And she was curled up like a pretzel in her bed from her illness. Her hands were flexed so that her fingers were touching her wrists, and her feet were permanently flexed and extended. Her parents met with doctors, and they agreed there's nothing more medically that could be done. And they said the next time she contracts pneumonia, which because of her lung situation, she would contract it on a regular basis, they would not try to revive her because it would just prolong her inevitable death. Well, then one day, a friend, called WMBI, which is the radio station in Chicago that's run by the Moody Bible Institute, a Christian radio station. And they said, would you announce and just ask people to pray for Barbara? Barbara's on her deathbed. She's really suffering. Would you please have people pray? And we know that a minimum of 450 Christians began to pray for Barbara. How do we know? Because they sent letters telling Barbara, we're praying for you. So what happened? I'm going to let Barbara describe to you what happened next, to tell you herself what happened on Pentecost Sunday with her friends who came to her to read her some of these encouraging letters that the people who were praying for her had written to her. So let's watch Barbara.
June 7th, 1981, I'll never forget it. It was a day like any other day for me. That was one spent confined to bed, unable to breathe on my own, hooked up to machines, a tracheostomy tube in my neck, my arms curled up, my legs curled up. I lay there trapped inside my own body is really how it felt. I had 2 friends over. They came over all the time. They were from my church. My church family never forgot me. So while they were there, I still remember exactly what they were reading when all of a sudden I heard a booming, authoritative, loud voice over my shoulder over here say, my child, get up and walk.
And there was nobody else in the room?
And there was no one else in the room, and the door was over here. There were windows over this way. And instantly, I knew it was God. But instantly, I also knew that my friends didn't hear that, which is kind of interesting, too.
Yeah.
And I needed to share with them what I heard. Well, I had this tracheostomy tube in my neck. That's how I breathed. And I had hands that did not work. So my friends said whenever I looked agitated, they knew I wanted to talk. So they'd come and plug the hole in my neck. And I said, I don't know what you're going to think about this, but God just told me to get up and walk. And my friends got really quiet. I know, but he really did tell me to get up and walk. Run, get my family. I want them to be here. And my friends all of a sudden jumped up, and while they jumped, So did I. I was so excited I couldn't wait for anyone. And I literally jumped out of the bed. This is where you'd almost have to have known me to see how totally impossible that was. So this time, I remember reaching up and pulling my oxygen off my neck. I remember that. And then I jumped toward the voice. My friends are over here, but I jumped towards the voice. And as I jumped up, the first thing I remember isn't what I would think I would remember, but I jumped out of the bed and I looked and I saw my feet. They were flat on the ground, just like everyone else's, which sounds normal, but not for me. I had foot drops so badly I couldn't even wear slippers on my feet. They were so curled. So when I jumped up to have feet flat, I was amazed and stood staring at my feet. And when I did that, I jumped like this, and then I saw my hands. And they were open, and they never opened. And so now they were open, and I stood staring at them, and then it dawned on me I could see me. That's what I would have thought I would have noticed first, was my vision. But I didn't.
It was back, you could see.
It was back, I was perfectly fine. And I stood staring again for a little while, just feeling what it felt like to look at and see me. And then I turned, and that's when we were like women. We all started jumping up and down, screaming and thanking the Lord. I remember I didn't understand anything, except where once I was real sick, I was well again. And it has to be God. That's all I knew.
Barbara was instantly and thoroughly healed. Her eyesight was immediately restored. Her lungs immediately went back to normal. Her mother came running into the room and fell to her knees and began to feel her calves. She said, "Your muscles are back." Her muscle tone had returned instantly to her legs so she could walk after 7 years. Her father came in and hugged her and then began waltzing with her around the room. Well, this was a Sunday that this happened, and there was a church service that night at her church, which was Wheaton Wesleyan Church in suburban Chicago. They were holding a service, and so at the point in the service, a pastor gets up and says, "Now, does anybody have any announcements they want to mention?" And with that, Barbara began to stroll down the aisle in front of everybody who had only known her for all these years as being curled up in a wheelchair or sick in bed. She comes strolling down the aisle, and the place erupts, and people begin singing, "Amazing Grace, I once was blind, and now I see." The next morning, she went to one of her doctors, Dr. Thomas Marshall, an internist for 30 years. And when he saw her walking toward him down the corridor, he said later, "My first reaction was, oh, she died and this is a ghost." That's the only way he could account for it. His response was this, quote, "This is medically impossible." Friends, God instantly and completely and astoundingly healed Barbara in one miraculous moment. There's no natural explanation for this. This was not some sort of spontaneous remission, which happens over a period of time, and the illness often comes back. This was instantaneous, her eyesight returning, her lungs reinflating, her entire body immediately healed. And how would you explain that voice telling her to get up and walk? This would be like a voice telling you, "Get up and fly." And you'd say, "Well, I can't do that." That's how wild it was for her. Say, "Get up and walk," after all these years. And yet she heard that. How do you explain that? Well, the illness has never come back today. This happened more than 30 years ago. Today, Barbara is married to a pastor, and they have a little church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And one of her doctors wrote this, quote, "I have never witnessed anything like this before or since, and considered it a rare privilege to observe the hand of God performing a true miracle." Friends, this is just one of several cases I document in my book, The Case for Miracles. I mean, I have credible accounts of dead coming back to life, of people being healed instantaneously of deafness and burns and broken ankles and meningitis and so after prayers to Jesus. Here's the point. God is still in the miracle business today.